Nobody expected a quiet, focused truck driver to be the one who would break the back of an underground trafficking ring. But then again, nobody knew what Victoria Blake had been through. She wasn't just another face behind the wheel of a big rig. She was a former military K9 handler with scars she didn't show, and a pair of German shepherds trained to take down insurgents, sniff out explosives, and neutralize threats before they even had a chance to blink. When she rolled out of the Phoenix depot that morning, her cargo wasn't just another job, it was a promise. A trailer full of life-saving medical supplies bound for a children's hospital in Dallas. Dozens of little patients were waiting on the gear strapped down inside that rig. Machines that would help them breathe, monitors that would track their fragile heartbeats, specialized tool surgeons needed to give some of those kids a shot at life. The kind of cargo you don't delay, the kind of cargo you protect with everything you've got. Victoria's day started long before dawn. The yard was still cloaked in shadows as she double-checked her route and walked a slow lap around her truck. Years of military service had drilled it into her. No matter how many times you've done it, you inspect everything. Tires, hoses, fuel lines. She didn't trust technology to do the job her instincts had been doing for years. In the passenger seat, Titan lifted his head as if to say, "Are we good?" And Victoria nodded. Coda was already alert in the sleeper cab, ears twitching at the rustle of something unseen outside the fence line. Most drivers wouldn't have noticed. Victoria did. She always did. The engine roared to life at exactly 4:05 a.m. She liked precision, liked sticking to her plan. She shifted into gear, adjusted her mirrors, and merged onto the highway with practiced ease, her mind already 10 miles ahead. The CB was quiet, too quiet for her liking. A few truckers called out weather patterns and road closures, but nothing unusual. Yet something gnawed at her gut, that low, creeping sense that something wasn't right. Coda and Titan weren't sleeping the way they normally did. They were still, silent, eyes fixed forward like they could sense what was coming long before the first threat would show itself. A voice finally crackled over the CB, and it wasn't the good kind. "Any eastbound drivers out past 210, watch your 6. Vulture's been spotted again. They're out hunting solo rigs." That was all it took. One sentence. Victoria's grip on the wheel tightened. The desert vultures. She'd heard of them. Every long-haul driver had. But most people thought they were just another outlaw gang flexing muscle in the desert. They weren't. They were disciplined, coordinated, and armed. And worse, they were smart. They didn't go after random shipments. They went after specific ones, high-value targets, just like hers. Victoria didn't change her expression, didn't flinch, didn't even adjust her speed. But inside, her training was already kicking in. Heart rate steady, breathing even, awareness heightening. The road ahead stretched into darkness, but her attention was split between the highway and every shadow on the shoulder, every pair of headlights in her mirrors, every movement outside the white line. This wasn't paranoia. This was survival. And when you've spent a decade moving military equipment through hot zones, you learn one thing above all else. When your gut says something's coming, you don't ignore it. You prepare. Coda shifted first, just a small move, barely noticeable, but Victoria saw it. Then Titan's ears perked. Both dogs were suddenly alert, no longer resting. She glanced at her GPS. Still another 800 miles to go, and now she was certain. This run wasn't going to be routine. Something was about to go sideways, and it wouldn't be a mechanical failure or a wrong turn. It would be a confrontation, one she hadn't asked for, but one she was more than ready for. The moment Coda let out that low, rumbling growl from the passenger seat, Victoria knew the situation had escalated from uneasy to active threat. That sound wasn't for boredom or discomfort. It was a signal, a quiet warning that something just shifted in the environment. Coda had only ever used that tone in combat zones. Once outside a village in Helmand when the scent of explosives hung too faint for humans to notice, and again in Syria, just seconds before a sniper's scope glinted in the distant hills. Victoria's hands stayed steady on the wheel, but every nerve in her body locked into combat awareness. Years of experience told her, Trust the dogs. Always trust the dogs. Titan, in the back, was up and moving, paws silent against the cab floor. He wasn't barking, not yet. But he was scanning, positioning. His frame angled slightly to the rear window, nose lifted, ears forward. There was something behind them. Victoria adjusted her mirror. At first, just open road. Then lights, faint but approaching fast. Not cars, bikes, a group of them. At least 5, maybe more. Riding tight, staggered formation. Too disciplined for casual riders, too fast for anyone out for a morning cruise. She could already picture the cut on their jackets. Desert vultures. The gang that had been bleeding truckers dry across the Southwest for the past 6 months. They moved like a pack of predators, targeting drivers who looked like easy prey, especially those traveling alone, without escort or convoy. Victoria wasn't alone, though. Not really. She had 2 of the best-trained dogs the military ever produced riding with her. Coda and Titan had completed missions that never even made it to the official records. Missions deep in enemy territory, clearing rooms, sniffing out traps, protecting diplomats, and tracking targets across broken, hostile landscapes. They were more than protection. They were family. And right now, they were telling her something loud and clear. This was going to be a fight. She ran a mental diagnostic of the truck, the road, the terrain. Half a tank of fuel. No major exits for another 30 miles. The shoulders were narrow, no place to pull off safely without being boxed in. There was a rest stop 5 miles ahead, but that would be a kill box if they pushed her there. Too isolated, too predictable. She'd read the after-action reports. 2 drivers found at a similar stop last month, one unconscious, one gone. Trailer doors forced open, cargo vanished. The cops called it organized theft. Victoria called it an ambush, and she wasn't about to be the next name in those reports. The CB radio crackled again, this time a different voice. Female, steady. Breaker 19, you got eastbound movement? Group of riders just peeled off 82 South. Looked like vultures. The voice had a name to match. Eleanor, a long-haul driver with a reputation for running clean, running smart, and keeping her ears open. Victoria keyed her mic. Copy that, Eleanor. They're behind me now. 5 and climbing. Running tight. There was a pause. Then Elena replied, Desert View Truck Plaza's clear. I passed through 15 minutes ago. Mile marker 218. If you need a lane to breathe, that's your best bet. Victoria marked it mentally. Options mattered. Escape routes mattered more. She wasn't planning to run, but planning to fight blind was worse. The lead biker was getting bolder now. He drifted close to the rear of her trailer, almost kissing the bumper, then eased back. A test. Probing. He wanted to see if she'd brake check, show fear, give him control of the rhythm. Victoria didn't bite. She just kept steady speed, eyes forward, hands calm. Titan had moved to the center, now seated beside the CB unit, watching the mirrors. Coda stayed locked on the right window, tracking shadows. Both of them understood the space, the movement, the tension. In many ways, this rig was a mobile command post, and these 2 dogs, they were the strike team. Another glance in the mirror showed more bikes joining, 7 now, maybe 8. She couldn't tell if they had weapons visible, but it didn't matter. They didn't need to flash guns to be dangerous. Their posture said it all. They were herding her, trying to funnel her into a vulnerable position. It was textbook intimidation, trap her between the road ahead and their numbers behind. Victoria didn't flinch. She'd seen this tactic before, except the last time it was pickup trucks loaded with insurgents on the outskirts of Kirkuk, not chrome-plated Harleys on the open highways of Arizona. Same playbook, different battlefield. She reached under her seat, not for a weapon, she didn't carry those anymore, but for the duffel, the same one she used overseas. Inside were essentials, tactical harnesses for the dogs, reinforced collars, remote signaling devices, even a handheld flash unit designed to disorient attackers long enough to gain distance. She hadn't used it in years, but today it might be the difference between a stolen truck and a successful delivery. Still no sirens, no patrol units, nothing official within range, just her, the truck, the cargo, and 2 dogs who understood the stakes, even if they couldn't say the words. Victoria looked at the side mirror again, then the rear view. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet, but firm. "All right, boys, looks like it's just us. Let's see if these clowns picked the wrong target." Coda gave a soft huff. Titan thumped his tail once, then went still again. The dogs didn't bark. They didn't pace. They waited, ready, focused, locked in, just like they always were before the first move. And out on the highway behind her, the desert vultures accelerated. The hunt had officially begun. Victoria never looked at her cargo like it was just a load. To someone else, it might have seemed like a trailer packed with crates, straps, labels, and manifest codes. But to her, every box represented a child, a face, a name, a family waiting in fear, counting on those supplies to arrive intact, on time, no matter what. She'd seen the list at dispatch. Neonatal ventilators, portable dialysis machines, chemo treatment kits for pediatric cancer wards, and even custom-formulated medication for rare genetic conditions. These weren't things you could just run down to the next hospital and borrow. Most of it was temperature-sensitive, tracked from pickup to delivery, with backup systems wired into her trailer to keep everything within range. There were children in Dallas whose lives would change the moment those boxes arrived. Some might survive because of them. Some might not survive without them. That was the weight she carried, and it wasn't measured in tons. As the sun crept over the eastern ridge, throwing long beams of dusty gold across the asphalt, Victoria thought about her old platoon leader. He used to say, "Mission first, people always." Back then, it meant the guys beside you, the ones kicking up dirt in your boots and watching your six. Now, it meant the people depending on her from hundreds of miles away. People who had no idea she was already being hunted by a gang that saw her rig as nothing more than dollar signs on wheels. The vultures didn't care what she carried. They didn't care if it was insulin, antibiotics, or heart monitors for premature babies. All they saw was the resale value. How much they could chop and move through their black market buyers in Mexico or overseas. They weren't just thugs on bikes anymore. They were part of something organized, something ruthless, something that saw every truck on the road as a payday. But Victoria knew something they didn't. She wasn't hauling for money. She wasn't even doing this for a company. She was doing it for the same reason she enlisted at 19, to serve. That part of her never left. It didn't vanish with the uniform or the base transfer paperwork. It didn't dissolve when she took her discharge and swapped camo for diesel. If anything, it burned hotter now. These kids in Dallas, they were her mission. And the vultures? They'd just stumbled into the worst mistake of their lives. Coda adjusted his stance again, now at full alert, nose angled toward the thin gap between her driver's window and the mirror housing. Titan stood at the ready, tail low, posture rigid. Victoria didn't need to give them verbal commands. They were trained for this, even if this was taking place on a civilian highway rather than a battlefield halfway around the world. Her mind flashed to a time in Kandahar when her convoy got boxed in between 2 crumbling mud walls. Only one exit, enemy fire incoming, drones overhead out of range. It had been Titan who detected the trap early, barking once, just once, to alert the team. That single bark had saved 5 lives. Now he was watching the mirrors again, body coiled, ready to do it all over. Her eyes flicked to the digital cargo monitor installed in her dash. All systems nominal. Temperatures were holding. Locks were sealed. But if the vultures got inside that trailer, the medical supplies wouldn't be the only loss. Those boxes had GPS tracking, serial codes, FDA oversight. If anything went missing, the entire shipment could be declared compromised. That meant delays. That meant red tape. That meant the hospital might not get replacements for days or weeks. Time that some of those kids didn't have. These weren't Amazon orders or retail goods. These were medical lifelines. Victoria considered her options. Pulling off to the side of the road wasn't one of them, not with the way the vultures were closing in. She could try to make it to the next truck plaza Elena mentioned, but if they had even one spotter there, it could be a setup. Another kill box. No, she needed to buy time. maneuver them, make them think she was nervous, make them underestimate her. The most important part of combat wasn't always firepower. Sometimes it was psychology. Make the enemy think they were in control, then take it from them. She tapped the brake twice, not enough to slow significantly, just enough to flash her brake lights. A signal, a test, and sure enough, 2 bikes accelerated, flanking her driver and passenger sides. Close enough now that she could see the patches on their vests, black and grey, wings spread wide, a vulture clutching a bleeding rose in its talons. Real subtle. The rider to her left made a show of lifting one hand from the handlebars, giving her a mocking wave before pointing to the shoulder and tapping his helmet. The message was clear. Pull over. Now, Victoria didn't react. She kept her face forward, expression neutral, as if she hadn't even noticed. Her fingers moved below the wheel, brushing against the edge of the dash panel until they found a switch. Just a small one, tucked behind the air vent. She flipped it. Nothing happened on the surface, but inside the trailer, a small backup cooling unit powered on. Not because the temperature was in danger, but because it activated a secondary sensor system, one that would immediately ping her phone if the trailer doors were tampered with. It was a patchwork of military surplus gear, civilian upgrades, and her own custom rigging, built for one purpose, to keep the mission safe, no matter where the mission went. Coda growled again, louder this time. Titan responded with a single sharp bark. That bark wasn't for Victoria. It was for them, the bikers, the ones riding close enough to see into her cab, expecting fear, hesitation, maybe panic. What they saw instead were 2 battle-hardened war dogs in tactical harnesses, muscles rippling beneath thick fur, eyes locked and unblinking, trained to move on command, trained to hit hard, trained to protect. The biker to her right hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. His engine sputtered slightly as he adjusted his throttle. Victoria caught it. She noted every detail, body language, posture, position. He wasn't just surprised. He was reassessing the situation. Good, let him. Because what he didn't realize was that he was trying to rob a rolling fortress. And what they all failed to understand was that the woman behind the wheel wasn't just a driver. She was the mission commander, the handler, the protector, and if they were planning to come for her cargo, they better be ready for what was coming next. Victoria's fingers hovered over the switch hidden under the steering column, feeling the familiar indent of the toggle she'd installed herself. It had never been used in a real-world scenario. Not yet. But today was starting to look like the day all that preparation, all those sleepless nights spent running worst-case simulations in her head, was going to pay off. She kept her eyes on the road, face unreadable, while her mind ran through layers of decision trees and tactical assessments. That kind of thinking never really leaves you, not after years of leading supply convoys through enemy territory, where every turn could hide a roadside bomb and every traffic jam could be an ambush. Now, the rules were different, but the stakes were just as high. These weren't soldiers or insurgents chasing her this time. These were outlaws, desperate, emboldened, and likely wired on a mix of drugs and greed, with nothing to lose and everything to gain from taking what she was carrying. The engine hummed beneath her feet, steady and responsive, but she could feel the pressure building behind her. The vultures were closing the noose, methodically, like they'd done this a dozen times before. 5 bikes had turned to 9, then 12. A whole formation now, surrounding her like wolves circling a stag. Some rode close to her sides, just outside arm's reach, while others drifted behind in staggered lines. It was a classic technique. Box the target in, control the movement, force a decision. They were hoping she'd do what most drivers did when overwhelmed. Panic, hit the brakes, pull over, give up. But Victoria Blake didn't panic. She had been through worse than this. She'd driven through live fire in Fallujah with smoke so thick you couldn't see the vehicle 10 feet in front of you. She'd navigated icy mountain passes in northern Afghanistan, knowing enemy lookouts were watching from the cliffs above. This wasn't new. This wasn't even intimidating. It was just familiar. Danger dressed up in leather and engine noise instead of camouflage and AKs. She glanced at Coda, who remained at full alert, his body like a coiled spring. Titan hadn't moved from his post, but his breathing had slowed and his pupils were tight. Both dogs were in work mode now, instincts honed from hundreds of hours of training kicking into gear. They knew something was coming. Victoria didn't need to say a word. She reached down slowly, unzipped the duffel between the seats, and pulled out their tactical harnesses. One by one, she slipped them over the dog's shoulders and buckled them in with practiced efficiency. Each vest was fitted with lightweight armor, modular pouches, and an embedded comms chip that synced with her earpiece and dashboard console. Civilian legal? Technically, yes, but they were custom-built with military specs, and more than once had drawn raised eyebrows from local law enforcement who'd been told the truth. These weren't pets. These were veterans. The biker riding closest to her left side revved his engine suddenly and motioned toward the shoulder with a gloved hand. She ignored him. Instead, she activated the first of several defensive systems wired discreetly into her truck. A set of low-frequency sensors began scanning the trailer's perimeter, ready to trigger a countermeasure if anyone tried to force the doors open. Another toggle engaged the side floodlights, non-lethal but painfully bright, mounted in discrete housings along the frame. If it came to it, she could light up the space around her like a landing strip. But not yet, not until she had confirmation they were going to act. The CB came alive again, Elena's voice sharp and urgent. "Vic, I've been listening in. Vultures are on a private channel, encrypted, but I caught pieces. They're coordinating something at mile marker 223. That's a known trouble zone. No cameras, no exits. Looks like they're setting up a full intercept." Victoria's jaw tightened. This wasn't just an impromptu hijacking. This was planned. They knew her route. They had scouts out, maybe even someone inside dispatch feeding them details. She responded calmly, "Copy. Bypass options." Elena hesitated. "You could swing through Old Copper Trail, but it's gravel, not friendly for a load like yours." Victoria thought for a moment. That road would cut 15 miles off her stretch with the gang and break their pattern. But it would also mean steep turns, loose shoulders, and no guardrails. Not ideal, but survivable. And right now, unpredictability was her only advantage. One of the riders suddenly veered ahead, positioning himself directly in front of her bumper. He slowed down just enough to force her to ease off the accelerator. A second biker took position behind her. Another trap. She couldn't see who was calling the shots, but they were good, organized. Definitely ex-military or trained by someone who was. That realization made her skin prickle. Random thugs didn't run these kinds of formations. This was a coordinated ambush, one built with experience, which meant someone had studied her, watched her patterns, maybe even knew her history. Victoria flexed her fingers on the wheel, ran a quick systems check, and prepared to make her move. She clicked the turn signal, a fake-out, more habit than necessity, and drifted half a lane to the right. The biker beside her adjusted, predictable. She noted his reaction time, 2 seconds too slow, probably not used to opponents who measured and responded. She toggled her left mirror to get a better view of the rider behind her. His eyes were hidden behind mirrored shades, but the way he gripped the bars told her everything she needed to know. He wasn't nervous, he was excited. That kind of confidence usually came from winning. Victoria intended to change that. The weight of the cargo sat heavy behind her, not just in pounds, but in responsibility. If they breached that trailer, even for a minute, everything could be lost. Temperature integrity, chain of custody, regulatory compliance, it would all go out the window. And once that happened, it didn't matter if she got the supplies to Dallas. They'd be worthless, discarded, delayed, and some of those kids didn't have time for delays. That was the part these bikers didn't understand. They thought they were hijacking medical goods. They weren't. They were hijacking hope. Victoria keyed her mic again. "Elena, let dispatch know we've got a high-risk transport under imminent threat. Don't name names. Just say it's a code Delta. They'll know what it means. Elena's breath caught slightly. Copy that. What's your play? Victoria exhaled through her nose, eyes locked on the narrow stretch of highway ahead. I'm not pulling over. I'm not surrendering. And I'm sure as hell not letting them touch this load. It's time to remind them that not every trucker is just a driver. She flicked the next switch. The trailer's rear plate retracted slightly, revealing an LED panel programmed with a warning message in 3 languages, one she'd used overseas when civilian convoys had to deter unwanted tailors in hostile zones. It simply read, "Military personnel on board. Do not engage." The biker behind her hesitated again, not enough to stop, but enough to make her smile. The game was still on, but now the rules were about to change. Call off your dogs, lady, or we'll put you down first. The threat came from the lead biker, a thick-shouldered man with a chipped tooth, mirrored sunglasses, and the kind of false bravado that comes from thinking you're holding all the cards. He shouted the words with a cocky smirk, like he'd already won. But what he didn't realize was that he'd just made the last mistake of his day, and maybe his life. Because if there was one thing Victoria Blake didn't take lightly, it was someone threatening her dogs. Not after everything they'd been through, not after what they'd given up together. That wasn't just crossing a line, that was lighting the fuse on a powder keg. She didn't look at him, didn't even blink. Her eyes stayed locked on the horizon, hands steady on the wheel. But something in the air changed. A shift, a hum. Coda's body went rigid, his ears straight up, nose flaring as he processed the tone, the volume, the intent behind the words. Titan moved into his strike posture, head lowered, tail locked, his weight slightly forward on his paws. Silent, controlled, waiting for her cue. These weren't pets. They didn't bark to scare. They didn't leap without permission. These were war dogs, professionals, and now they were on alert. Victoria's voice was a whisper, not meant for the biker, but for the 2 warriors at her side. Steady, boys. That was all it took. They relaxed their posture, just slightly, but their eyes never moved from the threat. They were reading body language, tension, movements, interpreting micro-gestures the way human soldiers read enemy troop formations. Years of field experience had turned them into something beyond ordinary canines. They were intuition sharpened to a lethal edge. The biker laughed as if he thought he'd rattled her. What? You think those mutts scare us? They're just dogs. That sentence, more than the threat, told Victoria everything she needed to know. He didn't get it. He didn't understand what those dogs were. He didn't recognize the vests they wore, custom-fitted with ballistic protection and reinforced hardware. He didn't see the combat medals subtly stitched into the side of Coda's harness, or the tiny tracking tag on Titan's collar with a code that traced back to a now declassified unit that operated Black Ops across 3 continents. He thought he was harassing a woman with pets, and that meant he was wildly out of his depth. She let the truck drift slightly into the rumble strip, just enough to shake the frame and draw attention from the bikers pacing her sides. Her mirrors showed that the rest of the pack was spreading out, some dropping back, others riding flank. They were trying to close the trap now, thinking she'd been sufficiently softened up. The leader lifted his arm and gave another exaggerated wave toward the shoulder, signaling her to pull over. Victoria let the truck slow by 2 miles per hour, just enough to suggest she was considering it. The bait had to be believable. A full stop would be dangerous. But a hesitation, that was the opening she needed. She tapped her CB mic. To anyone listening, eastbound, mile marker 224. Multiple riders attempting forced stop, medical cargo on board. Repeat, medical cargo, high priority. A pause. Then she added one more word. Engaging. She didn't wait for a response. She didn't need one. She just triggered a silent protocol used by military transporters who transitioned to civilian shipping, an unofficial network of veterans, law enforcement allies, and sympathetic drivers. She wasn't expecting cavalry, just a witness, just a record. The biker at her door raised his voice again. "Last warning, stop the truck, or we stop you." Victoria's fingers moved below the dashboard, flicking a switch that activated the first layer of her countermeasures. A tiny blue light on the dash lit up. To the casual observer, nothing happened. But in her trailer, reinforced paneling slid into place, locking down the most critical equipment. The electrical systems rerouted power to secondary batteries. And beneath the frame, pressure sensors activated in case anyone tried to crawl under or tamper with the landing gear. She didn't have weapons on board, but what she did have was strategy, learned the hard way through years of battlefield survival. She turned to Coda and Titan, speaking low. "Positions." The dogs moved without hesitation. Coda shifted to the passenger window, his frame filling the space like a sentry. Titan moved toward the narrow gap between the seats, bracing himself near the back of the cab, ready to deploy forward or back depending on where the threat came from. Both dogs were quiet, but the air was charged. Anyone with even a hint of tactical awareness would have felt it, that buzz of energy before contact, when all options vanish and the only thing left is instinct and training. Outside, the lead biker gestured aggressively. One of the others behind him reached for something. Victoria caught the movement in her mirror, subtle, underhanded. Probably not a gun, but maybe a tool, a chain, a baton, maybe a tire iron. It didn't matter. The moment one of them escalated to contact, the game would end. She pressed a final switch, one she'd wired herself. It activated the flash arrays mounted under the trailer, hidden behind weatherproof grates. She hadn't designed them to blind or harm. That would have crossed legal lines. But they were bright, disorienting, enough to buy time, enough to sow confusion. The biker behind her made the first mistake. He closed in too tight, misjudging the speed drop she'd been gradually making. His front wheel tapped her trailer bumper, and he had to swerve out to avoid a full collision. That gave her confirmation. They weren't just posturing anymore. They were initiating contact. "All right, boys," she said to her dogs, voice even, calm as a lake in winter. "Time to show them why they shouldn't mess with war dogs." Titan let out one sharp bark. Coda joined him with a low, vibrating growl that resonated through the cabin. The sound wasn't angry. It was surgical, intentional. It was the same bark they'd been trained to use in enclosed spaces overseas, designed to unnerve and destabilize opponents without needing physical engagement. Through the window, the biker closest to the cab flinched. For the first time, he saw them up close. Not shadows, not shapes, but real combat-ready dogs staring him down with intelligence in their eyes and discipline in their every breath. And Victoria? She smiled for the first time that morning. This wasn't just a delivery anymore. This was war. The vultures didn't realize it yet, but they were walking into a trap of their own making. Victoria had been here before, not here on this Arizona stretch of sun-scorched blacktop, but here, in the rhythm of danger, where the beat of her heart matched the tempo of the threat. She could feel it rising behind her, the hum of engines, the tightening pattern of movement. The vultures were pressing in from all sides now. Their formation wasn't random anymore. It was structured, like a net tightening around a fish. One rider ahead slowing down, forcing her to drop speed. Two more closing in on her flanks just outside the blind spots, making sure she couldn't swerve or turn. The rest hovered behind, a wall of snarling chrome and engine growls. They thought they were cornering a target. But what they didn't know was that the woman behind the wheel had spent years perfecting the art of reverse engineering an ambush. She didn't see the trap. She saw the weak spots in it. She saw the pattern and knew exactly how to break it. She clicked her right turn signal and drifted slightly toward the shoulder, baiting them. The rider on her passenger side immediately responded, matching her move and crowding close. Good. That's what she needed. She needed them confident. She needed them cocky. She needed them to think they were in control. From the corner of her eye, she saw his head turn, just enough to flash a grin beneath his helmet, the glint of teeth like a predator who believed the kill was inevitable. That's when she tapped the hidden switch beneath her left thigh. The undercarriage rumbled for just half a second. Then came the first blast, pure white light, erupting from beneath her trailer like a sunrise from the wrong direction. High-intensity strobe floods flashed in alternating patterns, bouncing off chrome and asphalt, scattering reflections in every direction. The biker to her right jerked violently, his bike wobbling as he fought to regain balance, disoriented by the sudden burst. The others behind her had it worse. The flash was engineered not to blind permanently, but to overload senses. It was a trick she'd learned during convoy escort missions where civilian traffic posed more threat than enemy fire. Confuse the senses, make them react, not think. While the vultures recoiled, Victoria made her move. She dropped 2 gears and surged forward. The big diesel engine responded with a roar, and her rig surged down the highway like a freight train shot from a cannon. The lead biker, the one who'd been slowing to block her, barely had time to react. She didn't hit him, she was too precise for that, but she came close enough that the wind off her cab rocked his bike. He veered hard to the left and lost control for just a second, skidding into the shoulder, tires screeching against gravel. It was enough. One weak point in their net, and she punched through it. Titan was barking now, loud, sharp, measured bursts. Not random noise, it was a signal, a rhythm, one they'd used in tunnels and alleyways to time coordinated movements during room sweeps and recoveries. Coda responded with his own bark, a deeper, slower tone. It wasn't just noise, it was communication. Tactical dogs didn't bark without purpose. They were keeping the beat while Victoria maneuvered, while the chaos behind her threatened to swallow itself whole. In her rear view, she caught sight of the vultures regrouping. Some of them were still shaking off the flashbang effect. Others were already accelerating again, angry now, reckless. They thought they had her. Now they knew they didn't. And nothing makes a predator more dangerous than the sudden realization it's not the one in control. The CB radio lit up. "Vic, that was you, wasn't it?" Elena's voice was a mix of concern and awe. "What the hell did you just do?" Victoria didn't smile. She didn't have time. "Sent a message," she said simply. "They're regrouping. I need you to contact State Patrol again. Tell them this isn't a random hijack. It's a coordinated attack on medical cargo. They're going to need to escalate this." There was a pause. Then Elena answered, voice low and serious. "Understood. I'll make the call. Just be careful. You're not the only one they've been watching." That line sat heavy. It confirmed something Victoria had already begun to suspect. This wasn't opportunistic. It was targeted. They weren't just after her load. They knew who she was, what she carried, possibly even who she used to be. The next mile passed in tense silence, engines roaring behind her, Coda and Titan still at full alert, her hands glued to the wheel. Then she saw it, mile marker 228. Her map told her it was a long-abandoned rest stop just past the rise. No exits, no cameras, just open space and enough distance from the main flow of traffic to do whatever you wanted without being noticed. A perfect place for an ambush. If she kept going straight, they'd try to force her into that pocket. She needed to turn the tables now, before they had time to fully reset their formation. She gritted her teeth and whispered, "Okay, let's spring this trap on our terms." As she crested the rise, she flicked on her hazard lights, not as a distress signal, but as another bait move. Behind her, the vultures surged, thinking she was breaking down, ready to pounce. Instead, she slammed on the switch that activated her rear fog dispersal system. Modified for legal compliance, it wasn't traditional fog. It was a dense, oil-based vapor, non-toxic, but thick enough to cloud vision and cling to helmets and visors. It rolled out from the back of her trailer in a wall of gray-white haze, blinding the bikers just as they crested the same rise. Confusion exploded behind her. Shouts, screams, the screech of tires and the grind of rubber fighting traction. Through her side mirror, she saw 2 of the bikes go wide, missing the shoulder and tumbling into the gravel. A third clipped the one in front of him, went sideways, and skidded hard. Dust and smoke swallowed them whole. The vultures hadn't planned for this. They were built for intimidation, not actual confrontation with someone who could fight back like this. Their training was muscle memory, not tactical precision. They'd never had a target like her, and now they were reeling. Inside the cab, Victoria finally allowed herself a moment to breathe, but not to relax. Because this was only the first round. The Vultures had numbers, resources, and now a grudge. But what they didn't know was that she had a whole playbook they'd never seen, and if they thought this was the worst she had to offer, they were in for a very long ride. In the rearview mirror, Victoria watched the last of the Vultures disappear into the smoke and confusion her flash and fog systems had left behind. A few bikes were still in pursuit, but their formation was broken now, uncoordinated, fractured, just angry engines and burning pride chasing a ghost they no longer understood. But that didn't mean the danger had passed. If anything, this was when things got worse, when an enemy regrouped, recalibrated, and came back meaner, smarter, more determined to finish what they started. And Victoria knew something with absolute certainty now. This wasn't a robbery. This wasn't about chance. It wasn't random. These men weren't just highway parasites looking for easy cargo to flip. They were after her specifically. This was personal, planned, surgical. She glanced at Titan, who had retreated from his alert position to sit beside her, chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. He hadn't relaxed. He never did, but he was processing, waiting for her next move. Coda remained at the passenger side window, his ears pivoting like radar dishes, tracking sounds beyond the range of human hearing. The dogs knew the tempo had shifted. They knew the break in contact wasn't peace. It was the eye of the storm. Victoria's hand hovered over the CB mic again. "Elena, you still with me?" "Still tracking you," came the immediate reply. "But you need to hear something. You were right. This wasn't random." There was a pause, the kind that said what came next wasn't good. "A buddy of mine, he works dispatch, owes me a favor. He checked internal logs after I told him what happened. Turns out your route was accessed this morning, flagged, by someone inside the system. But the kicker is, it wasn't under your company's access codes. It was someone from a third-party logistics firm, private, contracted." Another pause, heavier this time. "And you're not the only one who's been flagged recently." Victoria leaned back slightly, her mind spinning through possibilities. "Let me guess," she said quietly. "Other drivers, military backgrounds, some kind of service record." She didn't need confirmation. The pattern was crystal clear now. Not only had they planned this route, they'd planned for her. They'd studied her. They'd known what she'd be hauling, when she'd be hauling it, and exactly which stretch of highway she'd be most vulnerable on. This wasn't a gang hit. It was a coordinated op, and whoever was running it had experience. "Vic, there's more," Eleanor continued, her voice dropping. "You ever hear of a guy called Grayson Wolf?" The name landed like a punch to the ribs. Victoria hadn't heard it in years, not since Afghanistan. Wolf had been one of theirs, a handler, elite unit. He and his Malinois Rocco were legends for a while, until they weren't, until an operation went sideways, and $500,000 in military-grade gear disappeared along with him. Discharged under investigation, vanished off the grid. Rumors said he started training dogs for private contracts, mercenary work mostly. Rumors also said he'd crossed a line, started selling not just the gear, but the animals themselves, the kind of betrayal that made Victoria's blood run cold. She gripped the wheel tighter. "He's involved in this?" "We think so," Elena replied. "Goes by Crimson now, uses proxy operators, mostly gangs with muscle and no brains, like the Vultures. But the real asset isn't the cargo, Vic, it's you, or more specifically, your dogs." And there it was, the answer that made everything click. The threat wasn't about the medical supplies, that was just a bonus. They were targeting her because of Coda and Titan, because trained military dogs like them were priceless on the black market, not just for combat, for security firms, for mercenary outfits, for anyone who wanted elite muscle with zero conscience and zero legal oversight, and Victoria was the one person standing in the way of that kind of acquisition. "They're not going to stop," she said flatly. "This wasn't a one-shot ambush. This was the first step." Elena's voice tightened. "You need to get off-grid, switch routes, go dark. I've got a friend in Texas who can receive you. Ex-Army, owns a ranch, secure property. He's helped other handlers before." "No," Victoria interrupted. "This cargo still has to reach Dallas. We've got less than 30 hours. The kids waiting on this don't have time for detours. But I need help, logistical, visual confirmation, watch points." She took a breath. "And I need you to help me make them think I'm falling into the trap." "Wait," Elena said, alarmed. "You want to let them think they're winning?" "I want to let them think they've got me scared, that I'm running, that I'm cornered, that I'm alone, that I don't have options. Because if they believe that, they'll send Wolf in. And I want him close. I want him to see what it looks like when you come for a handler and her dogs and leave thinking you're in control." Silence on the line for a beat. Then Elena's voice returned, steady now. "Copy that. I'll get eyes in the sky. Talk to a guy who owes me. You're not alone, Vic." "I know," Victoria said, looking at Coda and Titan, who were both watching her now, steady and calm, like they knew the battle plan had just crystallized. "I never was." She leaned forward and marked her next detour on the map. An old mining road, rough, unpredictable, not on any GPS route planner. It would slow her down, but it would also throw the vultures off. And more importantly, it would buy her time to plan what came next. Because they'd made one fatal mistake. They'd gone after her dogs, and that meant this was never going to be a game they could win. Victoria eased the rig onto the narrow entrance of the old mining road, gravel crunching beneath the weight of 30 tons of steel and purpose. The tires rumbled as they met uneven terrain, dust kicking up in plumes behind her. Every mile she put between herself and the main highway widened the distance between her and the ambush that never quite got to Spring. But this wasn't escape. This was maneuver. Calculated. Controlled. She didn't run. She repositioned. Because the fight hadn't ended, it had just changed shape. And now it was hers to define. The mining road was barely marked, a long-forgotten trade artery carved through the hills and ridgelines decades ago, before satellites and surveillance, before cameras tracked every plate and drone footage could be bought on demand. This road didn't exist in the modern logistics database. No shipping manifests listed it as viable, but Victoria knew it. She'd driven it once during a disaster relief run years back, when a landslide had blocked the interstate and a medical team needed emergency oxygen tanks delivered to a high-altitude clinic. That day had been just as urgent, just as dangerous, and just like now, failure hadn't been an option. Coda shifted behind her seat, positioning himself so he could keep eyes on both the driver's side window and the rear of the cab. Titan remained motionless except for his ears, which twitched periodically in response to something only he could hear, something in the wind or distant engine reverberation, or maybe just the echo of threat itself. These dogs had been trained to recognize when a tactical posture shifted from reactive to offensive. And they could sense it now. Victoria wasn't preparing to survive anymore. She was preparing to fight. The landscape around them had changed. Rolling scrub brush gave way to rocky inclines and scattered stands of dead trees, wind-worn and skeletal. The trail curved along a ridgeline, one side a sharp drop into an arid canyon, the other a steep climb that ended in jagged stone. No passing lanes, no easy exits. Just her, the road, and the sound of grit grinding under tires as the sun burned hotter overhead. She glanced at her side mirror, nothing visible yet. But she knew they were coming. They'd regrouped, no doubt, reorganized. Whoever was running this op, Wolf, Crimson, whatever name he was using now, he wasn't the type to give up just because a few bikes went down. He'd assess, adapt, escalate. She'd seen it before. Men like him didn't quit. They reinforced. And now that he knew the flash and smoke tricks hadn't worked, he'd send in the professionals, the ones who didn't rely on numbers or noise, the ones trained the same way she was, which meant she had a narrow window to set the board before they caught up. She tapped her comms unit, opening a channel to Elena. "Any word on our friend?" "Yeah," Elena replied after a brief pause. "You were right. Wolf's operating under the alias Crimson. Private security contracts, black ops training, specialized in canine acquisition. He's not just running a side hustle. He's building something, recruiting, retooling, creating units that operate outside the system. And Vic, there's more. He's targeting handlers, specifically former military. 4 have gone missing in the last 6 months, all of them with elite K9s. All of them disappeared on long hauls, just like you." Victoria closed her eyes for a half-second, feeling a cold fire settle in her chest. "He's not building a black market," she said quietly. "He's building an army." "Exactly," Elena replied. "And he doesn't want the dogs. He wants the teams, dogs and handlers who already know how to work together. He doesn't have time to train from scratch. He's acquiring experience. He's trying to buy what we earned," Victoria muttered. "What we bled for." She looked at Coda and Titan. "And he thinks he can just take it." Another mile passed, dust rising, the sky widening above her like a lid about to slam shut. She checked her GPS. Nothing but static. Exactly how she wanted it. No tracking. No way for them to know where she was, unless they already had eyes on her. And if they did, she'd see it first. The road curved again, this time into a narrow bottleneck between 2 rocky outcrops. That was the point she'd marked, her engagement zone. It wasn't much, but it was defensible. Close quarters, limited visibility, perfect for confusion, perfect for turning strength into chaos. She eased the rig to a stop just past the rocks and reached into the overhead compartment, pulling down a small black box. Inside were her last resort tools, flares, a signal jammer, and 2 tactical modules she'd rigged herself from surplus gear. One was a deployable sonic emitter, designed to create disorienting pulses that mimicked the sound of incoming fire. The other was an old army trick, thermal decoy packs that could be tossed out and tracked by heat-seeking drones. She handed one to Titan. "Hold," she whispered. The dog took it carefully in his mouth, waiting for the next command. Coda watched her, tail thumping once on the floor. "Ready." "Vic," Eleanor's voice came through again, tight now, tense. "You've got movement on the back route. Drones just picked up 4 bikes closing in from the northeast and 2 SUVs following from the south. They're splitting your position. They know you're off the grid. This isn't about intercepting you anymore. This is about capture." "Let them try," Victoria said, her voice like stone. "They want a show? I'll give them one." She hit the external release button and opened the side compartments of the trailer. Not to arm anything dangerous, she'd never put bystanders at risk, but to prepare her final defense layer. The compartments contained the last part of her strategy, a mounted flood rig designed to blast light and motion from one side of the truck to the other in rapid succession. From a distance, it would look like the dogs were deploying left, or right, or both. Confuse the target, mask the real movement. Victoria crouched beside Coda now, pressing a thumb to the side of his collar, engaging his motion sensor. "This is our shot, boy," she said. "You remember what to do." Coda responded with a low huff, steady as ever. Titan stood beside him, waiting. The plan was simple. Let them come. Let them close the gap, just like they thought they wanted. Let them underestimate her. Let them fixate on the dogs, because that's when the trap would spring, and this time there would be no confusion about who was in control. The wind shifted just before they arrived. Victoria felt it in her bones, the way a seasoned hunter senses the presence of something just outside the tree line. That silent pressure in the atmosphere, like the world inhaling and holding its breath. The road ahead was nothing but a tight corridor of rock and dust, the old mining trail narrowing at its most treacherous bend, exactly where she wanted it. Coda was posted at the rear compartment, his body still as stone, eyes watching the direction they'd come. Titan, now harnessed and ready, waited near the passenger door, one paw lifted slightly, poised like a sprinter waiting for the gun. Both dogs were locked in, every muscle coiled, every nerve lit. The silence was broken by the distant, unmistakable rumble of engines, not just bikes, vehicles, SUVs, heavier than the two-wheelers, probably armored, no doubt brought in by Crimson himself, moving in now that his hired bikers had failed to get the job done. This was the escalation, the moment the real professionals were sent in to clean up the mess. Victoria had seen it play out before in war zones far from home. Send in the loud and brash to test the waters, and when that didn't work, send in the quiet ones with the silenced weapons and no names on their patches. But this time, the war zone was hers, and she had the home field advantage. She activated the flood pattern on the trailer's flank. A wave of light strobed across the body in irregular sequence, creating the illusion of rapid movement from within. Anyone watching from a distance would think a full security team was deploying from the vehicle. Quick shadows, figures moving, dogs shifting positions. It was all misdirection. The real action was behind the curtain. She slipped out the side door with Titan while Coda held his post. The rocks gave her natural cover, the kind she used to dream about having when pinned in urban warfare, and she crouched low, syncing her earpiece with the motion sensors placed earlier along the ridgeline. Movement pinged, 4 bikers coming fast. Then 2 SUVs drones above. Yes, she could hear the faint whisper of rotors, low altitude, fast sweep, pattern loops. No doubt they were feeding live intel to someone watching from a remote tablet. Probably Crimson himself, parked somewhere with eyes on the operation, thinking he was steps ahead of her. Thinking this was going to be simple, that he'd wear her down, exhaust her resources, then make the final grab when she was out of moves. But she'd planned for that too. She keyed into Elena. Confirm route intercept at Junction 12. Let the decoy convoy roll through. Keep radio chatter open. They need to believe I'm with it. Elena responded instantly. Copy. Decoy rig is in motion, fully rigged with 2 K9 lookalikes in harnesses. Painted markings match your unit. Looks perfect from a drone. They bought it so far. Good, Victoria said, because what's coming next? They're not ready for it. She signaled Titan with a soft click of her tongue. The dog moved like liquid shadow, slipping into position behind the far boulder near the rear of the trailer. From here, he could intercept anyone who tried to approach from the passenger side. Coda remained by the back hatch, still, waiting for his command. Victoria stayed low, checked her sidearm, not to fire it, but to be ready in case they got too close. She wasn't looking to hurt anyone, but she wasn't going to let them take what they came for. The first biker crested the bend too fast. He must have thought the fog and flash tactic earlier was all she had. He didn't see the flash suppressor on the ridge until it activated, blinding white light that flooded the entire trail for less than 2 seconds. It was enough. He swerved, clipped the edge of the rock, and went down hard, tumbling through the dust as his bike skidded out from under him. The second rider flinched and overcompensated. His front wheel lifted off the gravel, wobbled, then corrected. He stayed upright but slowed. He'd just learned the first rule of this game: don't trust your eyes. Then came the SUVs. They moved slower, more methodical, the kind of movement that told Victoria they were being guided. Someone was feeding them thermal scans or using predictive software to estimate her position. But that was the problem with software. It couldn't account for human creativity or for the dogs trained to fight in environments no drone could interpret. She activated the audio pulse emitter. From within the rocks, low-frequency sound bursts mimicked motion and speech, shouts, footsteps, canine barks, layered noise patterns designed to overwhelm auditory sensors. The SUVs halted, brake lights flaring, doors opened, armed men stepped out, tactical vests, silencers, clear hand signals between them. Not bikers, not local thugs. These were trained, but not trained like her, not trained like her dogs. They advanced slowly, spreading out to flank the truck. One of them raised a compact device, probably a jammer. Another held a tranquilizer rifle. Victoria's heart thumped cold at the sight of it. They weren't here for a firefight. They were here for the dogs. She gave the signal. Koda moved first, silent, precise. He bounded from his position and into the open, teeth bared, but not charging. He landed 5 feet in front of the man with the rifle, drawing attention, drawing aim. The man adjusted, bringing the barrel to bear. That was the mistake, because Titan came in from the side. He hit the rifleman at a downward angle, full speed, toppling him in a controlled collision. Not a bite, not a maul, a disarm, just like they'd trained. The rifle went skittering into the dirt, harmless. The man rolled, stunned but alive, reaching for a secondary weapon. But Koda was already there, hovering, growling, holding him in place without touching him. Every inch of his posture said, "Move, and I'll end it." The other operatives moved to respond, but they were too slow. The canyon was working against them now, echoes bouncing sound in the wrong directions, light patterns masking movement. One of them tripped on a thermal decoy pack that glowed red in his HUD. Another shouted a warning, too late. Victoria emerged from cover, sidearm aimed squarely at the lead SUV's tire. She fired. 1 shot. A hiss of escaping air, then the vehicle sagged as the rim dropped into the dirt. The team froze. "I know what you're here for," she said, her voice calm, loud enough to carry. "You came for the dogs. You thought I'd panic, that I'd surrender, that I'd give up what they are, so you could turn them into currency. But you're not taking anything from me. Not them. Not this cargo. Not today." She let the silence hang there. One of the operatives looked to the man on the ground, still pinned under the gaze of Koda and Titan. Another slowly raised his hands. Then another. The lead. Visor pulled back, jaw clenched, stared at her for a long second, calculating, measuring. But even he knew when a mission was over. They backed away. Victoria didn't relax. Not yet. She called the dogs back with a single word. They returned to her side in perfect formation, not panting, not anxious, just ready. Then the radio crackled again. "Vic," Elena said, "intercept at Junction 12, successful. Decoy convoy led them right into state troopers. They tried to bolt. Didn't work. We've got at least 7 in custody and a list of buyers pulled from a laptop in the SUV. It's bad. International. Wolf's network goes deep." Victoria looked out across the canyon, at the armed men retreating to their vehicles, at the dust settling from the scuffle. "Tell them to lock down every name on that list," she said, "because this wasn't the end. Wolf's still out there, and next time he won't just send contractors, he'll come himself." She turned to her dogs. "We'll be ready." The sun had dropped low behind the hills, casting long shadows that stretched like claws across the jagged Arizona earth. The heat still lingered, clinging to the rocks and pavement, but the light was fading fast. In the distance, sirens howled, muffled by the wind, and the rhythmic thud of helicopter blades grew louder by the second. But Victoria barely noticed. Her attention was fixed on the far ridge, where the last SUV had just disappeared over the horizon. The mercenaries had pulled back. They'd left without their prize, no dogs, no handler, no cargo, just bruised pride, a few broken ribs, and the chilling realization that this wasn't just some overqualified trucker they'd tangled with. This was something else entirely. Inside the cab of her rig, the dashboard lights glowed a soft green. Systems nominal, cargo secure, temperature steady. The shipment, critical pediatric supplies for a children's hospital in Dallas, was still safe, still within the acceptable range. But it wasn't just cargo anymore. It had become a line in the sand, something she'd sworn to deliver no matter the cost. Not because of the contract, not because of the paycheck, but because lives depended on it, fragile lives, children whose names she'd never know, whose faces she'd never see, but who needed what she carried more than anything in the world. That was her mission now, and missions were never optional. She leaned back in her seat and reached out to scratch behind Koda's ear. The big shepherd had settled back down after the confrontation, his breathing steady, his body relaxed, but his eyes were still alert, scanning the darkening trail ahead. Titan sat upright beside her, one paw resting on the center console, his head lifted slightly, as if listening to something only he could hear. Both dogs were ready. Always ready. They hadn't flinched once. Not when the operatives had surrounded the trailer, not when the flash detonated, not when the rifles were raised. They had moved with precision, discipline, the kind of trust that didn't come from command. It came from bond, from shared purpose, from surviving too many close calls together to count. Her comms buzzed again. "Vic, this is Nash. Just got off the line with Federal. They're confirming everything we pulled from the SUV laptops. Contracts, logistics chains, even shipping manifests for future hits. Crimson's network was targeting more than just you. 3 other drivers were already flagged. 2 in Florida, 1 in Idaho. All ex-military, all partnered with service dogs. This was the start of something bigger, and you stopped it." Victoria nodded slowly, more to herself than in response. "Did you get anything on Wolf directly?" she asked. There was a pause. "Not yet," Nash said. "He slipped the net again. By the time we got a bead on his signal, he was already en route to a secondary location. We've got teams following leads across 2 states. But this guy, he's good, knows how to vanish, and he's not acting alone." "Of course not," Victoria replied. "Men like him never do. They surround themselves with shadows and firewalls, but eventually they step into the light. They always do." Another voice broke through the line, Elena. "Vic, I've got good news and bad news. Good news is the detour you're taking will bypass all known intercept points between here and Dallas. Bad news, it's rough. No rest stops. No fuel until Amarillo. You sure you want to keep going tonight?" Victoria looked out across the fading canyon. The air had cooled enough to let the engine breathe better, and the dogs were still sharp. She'd been driving for hours, running on adrenaline and muscle memory, but her mind was clear. Clearer than it had been in years. There was something about being hunted, about standing your ground, that reminded you who you were beneath the layers of routine and paperwork and bills. This wasn't a job. This was a promise. "We go," she said. "Those kids don't have time to wait. If we sleep in shifts. Coda and Titan can rest while I drive. Then I'll catch 2 hours when we hit a safe zone. But we don't stop. Not until that hospital gets what it needs." "You got it," Elena said. "And Vic, hell of a thing you did out there. A lot of people owe you now, not just those kids." Victoria didn't respond to that. She didn't need thanks. She didn't want recognition. She just wanted to finish the run, because somewhere out there, Crimson was still watching. Maybe not tonight, maybe not even next week, but he'd come again. Someone like him always did. He'd adjust his strategy, study her response, use the failure to design something smarter, more efficient. He'd come with better mercenaries, deeper pockets, maybe even a new front. But no matter how many names he used, how many disguises he wore, Victoria would recognize the signature, and she'd be ready. She reached down and slid open the center console, pulling out the folded photo she always carried. It was old, creased in the corners, faded from time and sun. A little girl, maybe 5, holding a stuffed bear, her bald head wrapped in a pink scarf, a smile too big for her small frame. Her name was Leah. She'd been one of the kids from the first ever emergency delivery Victoria had made after leaving the military. The one that had changed everything, the reason she kept driving. Leah hadn't made it. But she had lived long enough to open that box, to start treatment, to hope. And that mattered. Victoria folded the photo again, slid it back in place, and shifted the truck into gear. The engine rumbled to life like a war drum, echoing through the canyon. She glanced at Coda, then Titan. Both dogs stared straight ahead, alert, composed. "Let's roll," she said. The road ahead was dark, winding, treacherous, but it was hers, and as long as she drew breath, no one, man, gang, or shadowed war profiteer, was going to take anything from her ever again. Not her mission, not her freedom, and definitely not her dogs.